Greetings and salutations. Welcome to another episode of 365 Days of Gaming. I appreciate you taking out time to check out this video. Like, comment, share, and subscribe. Thank you in advance. Today's episode is not necessarily a request, but it was requested, even though it was already on the list. So shout out to Larry, Larry Too Nasty, the home team, my brother from another, for suggesting, even though I was going to do it, that I do this game. And he was like, I just want to know what your thoughts are on certain parts of the game. And the game I'm talking about is the original Castlevania. Now, what he wanted to know was what my thoughts were about certain enemy types. And let me say, I don't even need to tell you which types. Let me just say about all types. They are all cheap. Now, this game is a classic. Let me not get it confused. Let me not, this is not a curveball type of situation where I try to tell you about how bad Castlevania is. This is a legend. This is a classic. And even with all the frustrations and the things that were cheap about this game, it's still a classic. But specifically to the enemies like the Medusa heads, my goodness, you want to talk about frustrating a child? I repressed some of these Castlevania based memories until I started playing this game again. And I remember certain things about this game when I played it. Like the first thing I thought was, oh, this is going to be like Ninja Gaiden because of the life bar style. You have your life bar, then you got the enemy for when you get to the boss. The way the game kind of starts with you, walking up to the castle. I'm like, oh yeah, even though this is Konami and not Tecmo, it had the same kind of vibe to it, right? So I'm super excited as a kid getting ready to play this. And I just remember being like, the only thing I could think of that was more irritating in this game, which we'll also have a video later, is ghouls and ghosts and goblins, whatever version you want to call it. But you know what I'm talking about. Like that's the only more frustrating, action adventure game that I could think of. And I know we're working with the limitations of the NES, and like Super Castlevania is obviously better and all of that. But we got to recognize the brilliance of the original game, like the enemy diversity first and foremost in Castlevania. I really don't remember seeing that many different types of enemies, bosses, and everything in a NES game back in the day. Like that was one thing Castlevania always had, was creative enemies, even if they were technically staples in the game. In the grand scheme of things, most NES games, you might get like 6 different enemy types. Maybe they change the color, but they're essentially the same version. They might take extra hits. But in Castlevania, like every floor, they giving you somebody else. You got, obviously you got the base stuff like skeletons and zombies and whatnot. But then you start getting like the merman, you start getting the Medusa heads, you got the little dudes that's jumping, you got like beasts of different kinds, the flying bats. Just like, they just keep hitting you with stuff. And I really appreciate the difficulty of this game now that I'm older, because I can see how the game is really based on the journey, not necessarily the destination. Now, let me be clear. The destination is very important and it's still the highlight of the game, but you can see how it was all about trying to get to the next part, because you can die and then you could just continue from the level, but it's like, can you get to the end? And that was Castlevania's calling card for me. It was like, can you make it to the end? And I think that this game obviously, doesn't need me to sing its praises. It's the beginning of a long-standing franchise. And even when it switched to the Metroid style with Symphony of the Night and everything, it still always had that kind of originality and, that Castlevania flavor. It never really lost it. Even with the switch over into the, that remake they did, it still had the Castlevania variety of enemies, locations. It's always been a visually appealing game, even with the limitations of the NES. But when you go into the SNES and then the PlayStations and stuff like that, you could just see it. I'm a big fan of all versions of Castlevania, including the first one. Now, I know certain ones didn't quite, meet the standard of Castlevania, but especially with the original one, it set the tone, and obviously for difficulty. And you know what? Being older, I can see how some of the times I died, it was probably a lot more obvious than I originally thought, but I just didn't know any better. And when I came back and I started playing these levels and kind of going through different parts of it, I'm like, okay, yeah, I could see how, if you're not paying attention, that could trip you up. And then I also saw that there were certain parts where, there's nothing I could do about that. And I will say, if there's one thing that this game has that is extremely frustrating, no matter, how I feel about the game as a whole, the stairs are a nightmare. Like stairs, and some of you may be laughing at me saying, come on, man, the stairs ain't that tough. Well, to me, they are. I have trouble because I'll try to get on the stairs and can't get on them. But then when I don't want to get on the stairs, it's all he wants to do is go up and down flights of stairs. So, there are some neck grabbing things that they do, but there's always things you can do in return. The items that you get on here. I will say this too about Castlevania. I always thought that the items that you get, the secondary items, your up B moves, it was always better than Ninja Gaiden. And I like Ninja Gaiden a lot. It's one of my favorite franchises, but they always left a little bit to be desired in comparison to Castlevania when it came to those additional items, like being able to just freeze time, fantastic. Being able to, the holy water, the boomerang, all those different versions. Those things are really cool and really necessary and really can change the course of a stage for you if you use them right. And I always felt like the stuff on Ninja Gaiden, it was like you might as well just stick with the regular, shuriken. That was pretty much the only thing you needed because the other stuff you couldn't really rely on half the time. But with Castlevania, everything has a use, even the knives. If I know people like to kind of harp on the knife as being like the basic weapon, but it has its uses. There are things that it can get you out of a jam in. And that's another thing about Castlevania. There's so many different ways to play because of the items. Yes, you have the vampire killer whip, but then the items change your play style, And just to give another shout out to Larry, he was talking about using the boomerang in order to fight death. And I was like, that's something I never thought about. And he was like, yeah, I figured out, I could get him in a certain area and kind of keep him in that location and use the boomerang to my advantage. And another thing I appreciate about this game is when you get to the boss, it's if you can get them down before they get you down, you win. That's it. You get a refill on health and everything on the next level. So I always thought that Castlevania was more fair than they got credit for. But with that said, the Medusa heads are very irritating and they cause a lot of problems. And, I get stubborn and I want to kill them when you should just avoid them at all costs, right? There's no real reason to engage in combat with them. You're not going to gain anything. They never really drop anything that you can't get any other way. They're just there to irritate you and to knock you in the hole, which you will see them do several times. There was nothing I could do, and I really think that you should be more supportive than, laughing at me getting knocked into the hole by Medusa heads. But anyway, what else can I say about this? This is Castlevania. You know it, you love it. If you don't, there's nothing I could do for you. So if you haven't played it, you probably don't want to play it. But if you have, let me know favorite bosses, your favorite version of it. I know we're talking about the original, but there's so many versions of Castlevania. Let me know which one you thought was one of your favorites. And I will assure you, there will be more Castlevania games on this list, so stay tuned. As always, be safe, have fun. Peace.